may resonate with this, you may not, but it's something that I think that is compelling to a lot of people. I know nothing of the universe. Let me state that again, or read it again. I know nothing of the universe except it be for my senses, which like you I cannot help but trust. Even when I verify, when possible, it still requires my senses. We all have faith in our senses. Among the things that I sense is this presence of otherness. So I have faith that there is an otherness present, but what it is, well, that is another issue. So I have faith in my senses that they sense something real, but I have learned that my understanding of what I sense is an altogether a much different matter. Believing that I have sensed an otherness and believing what that otherness might be are not even reconcilable unless I settle for poetry. It is a epic poem in constant rewrite, and so I move from faith to faith, and it's often messy. We post this over and over again, simply trying to let people know that there are some people who sense this presence of otherness. They speak about it as if it's sentient. It's an amazing experience, to say the least. Bob calls it theoqualia. I can resonate with that. At times people relate or resonate with Bible story, not because they think that's actually what's going on, but they like hearing other people talk about this experience with otherness. So with that said, we're going to have a show tonight, and it's talking about you feel God's presence. So what? Good morning, Bob. Okay, you're going to have to unmute.
I rarely mute because I'm a bad boy, and then this time I was muted. So yeah, no, it's good to be back. I've been gone all weekend, but so anyhow, I think this is going to be a good topic, and I hope we can address it with both honesty and fairness. And a while back, we talked about was it Nagel? I can't remember the details, but remember the question: what is it like to be a bat? Remember that question?
Right.
Bats have this supersonic ability to use sound to be able to see, as it were. Now, I say as it were because the question, what is it like to be a bat, is a question where we have to be honest. We have no idea what it's like to be a bat. We're not bats. Bats evidently have sensory perception that operates in a way different than our own sensory perception. About the closest we could come to that is this. What if you had some sort of a brain anomaly, and as a result, the nerves that went from your tongue to your brain just were not functioning properly, and as a result, you don't taste anything ever. Well, if you were to ask somebody, well, what does salt taste like? How can you describe this to somebody who can't have that experience? You're talking about a sensory perception. I mean, in what way is salt like the color red, or the tone of 1500 hertz, or the texture of velvet, or a cold, shivering temperature? These are all different sensory perceptions, and although we have at times come up with some interesting analogies, those analogies all fail to a large degree. And so when we talk about people who say that they feel God's presence, well, what do they feel? Well, if that's something that you do feel, or you feel something that you think is that, nobody else knows what it is you're actually feeling. They have no idea. And just whatever it is you're feeling, we have no way of knowing. If two people who claim, I feel God's presence, we have no idea if what they're both experiencing as a sensation is the same sensation, or totally different sensations, or what's going on here. And as a result, there are many people who have tried to determine what some of these pseudo sensations might be that could explain that somebody thinks they feel the presence of God. And okay, so we may even be able to make a case that that's something that happens. How do we make a case that that's always the case? I don't know that we can. And so I'm hoping that part of what I'm saying here tonight is that this is a question that cannot be answered with any kind of certainty because it involves a private qualia that can never, ever be confirmed or compared, ever, without regard to how authentic or inauthentic that experience is. It's basically an experience. But I do think we are certainly well within our reason, and we're well warranted to ask, questions about, are all of them warranted? Are all of them real? Particularly when you see the way some people teach. A lot of charismatic churches or even Pentecostal churches make a great deal about this experience of presence. Some churches don't. I mean, some of the more conservative Baptist-like churches, not all of them, but some of them are, it's like the woman visits the Baptist church and she's sitting in the back and during the service and while the pastor's preaching, she's going, "Oh, hallelujah!" "Oh, praise the Lord!" and oh, glory and wonder, and then finally, people in the church are kind of a little upset with her boisterous personality, and pastor kind of signals to the usher to kind of work his way over, and just as he gets over to her and is ready to tap her on the shoulder, she's saying, "Oh, praise God!" And the usher says, "Ma'am, we don't do that here." you know, uh, there are different cultural issues and practices, but when you find, for example, you go to a church and say, well, here's what we want you to do. We want you to come forward. We want you to be confessing all your sin. Come clean. And you will begin to experience this very essential presence of God. Or maybe they say, no, here, read these scriptures and really meditate upon them and then sit and wait for God's presence to come to you, or get caught up in repeating this love song to God, or maybe they will ask you to pray for it, or just speak the name of Jesus, or maybe you just need to have us lay hands upon you and you will receive the Holy Spirit, or maybe if you were to visit a holy site or a site that's holy to you, this will invoke this. Now, these methods are obviously, without regard to how authentic they may or may not be, one thing about them is they're obviously an attempt to invoke an experience. I find myself very skeptical of that kind of thing. When I say very skeptical, I'm not prepared to deny it altogether, but I'm certainly not in any manner compelled to feel like I really need to take that seriously. I don't. And so as a result, I can say that being one of these people who says, I experience this presence of otherness, and I have since I was a kid at the age of 6, being one of those people for me, it has always been spontaneous, it has always been quite constant, and not necessarily related to anything I am or am not doing. I find that when I see people doing things like this, I'm feeling like my immediate reaction is, how fake is that? It's kind of like, and this could be arrogance on my part. I admit to that. I have this experience, and I would like to think that my experience is authentic. I'm not a fool like everyone else. My experiences, they're all authentic. That's the way a lot of us think. But so, I can't really be a proper judge, perhaps, of comparing myself to others. But I would have to say that my knee-jerk reaction when I see people trying to, stir up that sense is like, nah, that strikes me as entirely fake. I don't know that I've ever stirred it up. It's something I just find myself constantly aware of. Oh yeah, I can become preoccupied and focused on other things, but it's kind of like, you can have a toothache and be so focused on something you're reading that you forget for a moment how much your tooth hurts until you stop reading and you go, oh yeah, wow, and you're but so there's this thing, and we've called it theoqualia. What is it? Well, I don't think we can make any claim about it. We can express our thoughts and our beliefs, and I have certainly expressed the fact that I have this experience, and it is for me the foundational reason why I find myself believing in God. It's no doubt for me a significant reason why I do. And so, when someone says, "Well, what does that presence feel like?" I I don't know how to describe it, but I mean, like I've talked to some people who like had a kidney stone, and what does it feel like? And well, they can describe it, but you know what? If they get a second kidney stone, chances are, if they get that second kidney stone, they know exactly what that is, because they've had that feeling before. And as a result, it's it's hard to understand how we can even really talk about this. I certainly would agree from an intellectual standpoint. We can't talk about it in a compelling way. But then again, when you asked me if I wanted to talk about this, and I said sure, and you asked me to give you a title, I wanted I wanted to close the title off with "So what?" You know, so the person has this experience. So what? Um, are they ill, or what tends to be the consequence of just such an experience? And my experience has been that the vast majority of people who seem to express that they have just such an experience, um, I've noticed that there's some people who simply claim to have it, but they never really respond to it other than in an emotional way, which, and in a way that strikes me as being an escape. Um, I think that, in the biblical text, most of the so called mountaintop experiences that you see in the biblical text are going on for people who are on the mountaintop with an experience for the purpose of then taking that experience with them down into the valley below. It's the mountaintop experience is not about the mountaintop, you know. And which strikes me as being different, whereas a lot of these people running to the presence of God are going for the mountaintop experience as a way of just getting away from the valley, which I don't know. That strikes me as being psychologically even unhealthy. Now, maybe I'm judging that unfairly, but that's just the way that it strikes me. Anyhow, so I've kind of introduced this topic. I'm curious about what sort of questions I might have provoked just from what I said. I got a lot more to say, but because I want to talk about who are these people who tend to experience this, and what is it that might be different in various ways that we might notice about such people.
Okay, we do have a few questions, Bob. One
Cool.
gentleman said or asked, and I'm going to rephrase it. What you're sensing. How do you know that it's God as opposed to something else?
I don't. I don't. I mean, if I see something with my eyes, and there are other people who see that with their eyes too, and we can approach it, and we can measure it, and we can weigh it. We have a wide variety of empirical ways of determining what am I seeing. If we experience a sensation that does not appear to possess empirical access, I don't know that there's anything that we can know. And I think that there's a need perhaps to be humble about the fact that if you have this gut sense, well, you've got that gut sense, but that doesn't prove anything. The experience is unfortunately unavailable for examination, and and I think that therefore it is one's private experience, and one can only just try to handle that own personal experience as responsibly as they can, and recognize, I would hope, that whatever it is they make of it is whatever it is they're making of it, for whatever reason, known or unknown, that they're making that of it. And so I would not defend my belief that this is God's presence that I have felt. I could not defend that or make that as an assertion. I'm just really here to report that that's how I resonate with it. That's how I would describe it, because it feels sentient. It also feels to me something that invites my sense of relaxation and peace and things like that. But I'll tell you this, the very first time I ever was conscious of having that experience, I was about 6 years of age. And at the time, my parents were attending an Episcopal church. And I can tell you this, that when I was in the congregation or in the Sunday school classes and these people are talking about God, I had no idea what they were talking about. I, because I had this experience of presence that none of them seemed to ever talk about. And what they did talk about struck me as having nothing to do with this sense of presence. And I think that even at the age of 6, I found myself believing in God, but had no idea if these people believed in God, or if God, as they understood him, had anything to do with who God might really be. You know, they're talking about Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and I don't know anything about that. And the way they talked didn't even relate to me. And I remember even this went on for years. And finally, around the age of 12 or 13, I'm sitting in the congregation one day, and I'm looking up at the minister who's preaching, and I'm saying to myself, I don't think he knows anything. I mean, I'm not hearing anything that tells me he knows anything about God. And I don't know anything about God. So I don't know what he's doing up there, and he's not doing anything for me. But if I ever knew what to do or what to say, I would want to get up there and do that and say that, because I'd like to talk about this and I don't know how to. So I remember very early on that my experience of this presence was one that I recognized didn't fit neatly into the paradigm that other people around me were talking about or engaged in their religious practices, you know. So it was an unusual thing. But I hope that answers the question that that this is not the kind of thing that one can know with that sort of certainty. Although, if it feels to you to be that way, and I'm using the word feel as really an analogy, not an actual sensation of the kind that we feel with texture or feel with our emotions. If that's what it feels like to you, and that seems to be the way you experience it, that it's a sentient otherness, then that's what you're going to make sense of it as anyway, you know, because that's what it feels like, you know.
Okay, let's take this a little bit further, and this would be my question. Developmentally, to what extent and in what ways are we built by nature to arrive at understanding X, Y, and Z? And let me tag this on. And are we built to be initially neutral about the world we find ourselves in? And so if we do experience this presence of otherness, you know, otherness is simply a term, and some people would ask, you know, is this otherness, is this meanness, or if people supply the term God there, I mean, what's really going on? And so let's back up to my first question. Are we, we're not built, that is, in ways to, let's say, to arrive at X, Y, and Z, nor are we neutral about the world. And so the question would be, empirically, we're not all hardwired that way. And so, we're looking at how we're hardwired versus our experiences and what we've learned, And so talk about that for a moment in light of this presence of otherness.
Well, those are very interesting problems to talk about. And I would argue that I'm not so sure we can have any real answers for that. We can have some ideas and theories. But for example, why is it that everyone doesn't feel this? Why is it that some people do? Well, we can come up with some possible answers. Maybe there's something that went wrong in people, and that's why they feel this, Or maybe there's something that went wrong in some people, and that's why they don't. How would we know this? Maybe this is something that only some people experience that others don't, and the reason is that this is actually some sort of spandrel of evolution, and that's all it is. We How could we ever go about determining which of these is the explanation? Oh, we might like some of those explanations. I mean, if I'm a person who has this experience, oh, I love explanations that validate it, of course, because I don't want people to think I'm crazy. I don't want people to think that I'm, mentally detached from reality. No, I don't want people to think that. And so I'm going to love those stories that tell people, oh, no, this is what he said. He's doing this, really, But what if I'm an atheist? Well, I'm probably going to love those stories that talk about how, well, this is just induced, and it's and it's he got real ill when he was like 4 years old, almost died, and so he's got this kind of quirk going on inside of his brain, and there's you're going to like the story that tends to justify yourself, and I will have to admit, I liked the stories that justified myself, but being a person who likes to at least pursue intellectual questions, I've had to come to the point where I realize if I'm going to be honest and intellectual, I got nothing. I got nothing. I do have this experience. What explains it? Well, I've pursued that many, many, many times. I don't know what actually explains it. All I know is this is what I have as an experience. And I've learned to live with that. And I've learned to relate to that. And I've learned that for better or worse, that's me. And I accept me and I deal with me. And as you began the show, you talked about we trust our senses. I can't not have this experience. And so I don't know how to do that. And but I think that I've tried to be at least intellectually honest enough to recognize that this is a problem.
Okay.
When it comes to trying to make sense of it.
Before I turn it to Daryl and Diana, because I'd like their input on this particular topic tonight, I would like for you to take one particular experience that you had with this presence of otherness and go into the details. What is this like? I know what it has been like for me. I don't know. I don't want to put on the table what my experiences are here. This is more about you tonight. And so could you put that on the table for us, please?
Well, first of all, when there's an experience that you have that is so constant, it doesn't usually stand out. So that it's not like, well, yeah, and I remember the time when, I have a hard time trying to remember a time when I did not feel this. My earliest memories go back to about 6 years of age, and I can recall very distinctly that I was at this church, and the church I was raised in, and I found that when I was in the basement, that I had this. That it was particularly heightened while I was there. I became heightenedly aware of it, but and I was also aware of the fact that I seemed to be having this experience and nobody else was. but the only thing I was doing was hanging out by the furnace door, and and when I went up into the congregation, when I was sitting there, or if I was in Sunday school class, even as a kid, uh, I remember the experience being so distracting that it was like I was not paying so much attention to that sense of that presence. But there was a sense that I was never alone, never completely alone. And I wasn't worried about it either. I mean, it wasn't an uncomfortable sensation. And I imagine that, if that was your constant sensation, that that it just becomes normal to you. But were there any times when it was particularly strong or particularly commanding? I would have to say that my earliest memories of them were very strong. There were times when I would find myself asking, "What is this for?" You know, because it didn't seem to do anything in my life. I mean, it's not as if God was there helping me or giving me tips or or explaining things to me or anything like that. It was just there. That was it. There. And I would have to say that when I had that, as I mentioned earlier, when I was around 12 or 13, and I was feeling like I wanted to, if I ever knew what to say about this, I would want to, and I'd want to be one of those ministers up there in the pulpit. Uh, that was a time when I felt very comfortable with that, and where I felt like I really wanted to lean into this experience and explore it more deeply, and started to try to, and began experimenting with things, even things like what I had mentioned earlier about, singing or praying or reading scripture and things like this. And I don't think that those particularly had any effect on me that I recall in any particular way. There were other experiences that I've had that involved crises in my life where there were a few times when things like that would happen. I don't know what to make of those experiences either. And I found that when I shared those experiences with others, I got a couple of different reactions that I really didn't care for. Some people would just treat me like I must have been weird and an idiot, and of course nobody likes being treated that way. But other people would act like, "Oh wow, that's awesome," and I'm thinking, no, it's not. You know, it is what I'm experiencing, but I don't know that awesome. In other words, I felt like they were treating me as if it somehow made me spiritually special, and I didn't like that feeling or that idea. I didn't think that's not the message I thought I was getting from, or the implications I thought I was drawing from that experience. And so I found those reactions to be so uncomfortable that when I was talking to other people who were actually believers in God, I didn't want to talk about that kind of experience, because uh, I didn't like what they were making of it, or what they did with it. But anyway, I mean, that's at least my initial reaction to your question about some of those times.
I will say this, in my experiences with otherness, it it's as if it makes me feel good about me. Uh, it has, I don't want to use cliche terms here, but I feel, and I can't say it any other way, but I feel as if this is one of the reasons that I'm so skeptical and I am not afraid to suspend judgment, has to do with this presence of otherness, because I feel quite content with not knowing. I don't feel obligated to jump into theism or atheism. So I don't know. I'd like to
Well,
talk a little bit about my experiences at some point, because I think that sometimes people read so much into God, 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 Jesus, Jesus, and so on. And I know that you're too unconventional to even pose the notion of Jesus or God in the typical way, and I don't want people to get lost in terms of what you're attempting to say here tonight, because I think that you've always been extremely authentic with me, honest, and I do resonate with you not attempting to tether this to a biblical story or anything like this. You're just saying this is an experience that I've had from this particular age. I don't know whether it's me, I don't know whether it's God, but this is what I'm resonating with. It seems to be sentient. It seems to be very good, and so I like that.
Well, I did try to tether it to, at the age of 18 is when I started considering Christianity as a possible valid faith. I'd say that prior to 18, I didn't resonate with Christianity at all, that I was aware of. I mean, I grew up in an Episcopal church, and my family was very regular in attending there, but it was more of a ritualistic church. We went there, we'd kneel, we'd stand, we'd sing, we'd read a hymn, we'd read it was more of a just kind of a procedural ritual thing, and I never really got much out of that, and I certainly didn't connect it as having any significant connection to the experience that I was having. But at about the age of 18, I actually started reading the Bible and found myself impressed with some of the things that I found in there. And so I thought, well, let's look into this a little bit more deeply. And so I did. And I think I gave about, almost 7 years of really trying to see if my experience could be shoehorned into that paradigm, that framework. And I think it felt to me at times like it was fitting, but it also felt to me at times like it wasn't. And I ended up becoming a Christian minister. And I can remember one time I was in my office at one of the churches that I was at, and reading the biblical text in portions of what we call the Old Testament, and reading it and finding myself disgusted at what I was reading,
Right.
and troubled over the fact that here I am, I'm trying to be the pastor of a Christian church, and supposedly this text is one that we revere, and I'm reading portions of it, and I'm finding it repugnant, and so having and yet it was for me a mixed bag. There were some texts I'd read that were very, very important to me, and others that, and so I really think that, when I look at the Old Testament, the New Testament, I think I see people who were grasping for God, and in some ways had some very interesting and marvelous things to say, but that they were nonetheless still trying to work from a framework of a particular religion.
Right.
That just forced them to add all of the cultural and anthropological details to it until it was finally hanging on so many facts or notions or implications that I found that it just wasn't me, So that had to come to an end. But if I could head this in a slightly different direction, but before I do, I'm curious to hear what Daryl and Diana might have as a response to what we've already said. And then I want to talk about some of the implications and causes or implications for others and implications to myself that I think have come out of that kind of experience for those people who seem to be like me having that. So I'm curious, who wants to go first, Diana or Daryl?
I will. First of all, I want to go on record as saying it's fascinating being a human. I mean, I've never been anything else, but to me, it's very fascinating just being human and experiencing what we experience. I'm a person that for years, and quite a few years, I won't say I'm ashamed to say it, but I've lived most of my life uh, giving God all the glory, to the point that one time a woman said to me, "You're a good man." And my response was, "There's none good but one." And I wouldn't claim any credit for anything good in me. If it was good, it had to be God. Well, still to this day, to be honest about it, this sense that you talk about, Bob, I sense empowerment, whether it be just to be able to get up and face the day with a good attitude, go and greet people as if they count, being kind rather than unkind, even if someone is being unkind to me, and etc. Um, Even comfort, times when I'm really troubled, like the song says, like a bridge over troubled water. There's just something there that seems to find a way to give me comfort. And to be fully honest about it, it doesn't really matter to me at this point whether this that I sense is from another source, possibly God, or it's just coming from me. The fact that it's there is great encouragement. And I realize I'm human. And if I'm human and I experience these wonderful things, I don't know why they wouldn't be available for every human being. And that's really, at this point, all that matters to me. If someday we discover and have all the empirical evidence we need to confirm that this otherness, there really is something there, fine. If we don't, fine. The fact is, if we're human beings and we can experience wonderful things in life, relate to one another in a powerful way, in a meaningful way, I don't know, but what that shouldn't be good enough.
I hear you. Diana.
Yeah, before I start on this, if I could crank things back about 20 minutes, that question to you, Bob, came from Cap Bruni, who is a big sweetie. Cap and I are friends, and I think they're here possibly on my suggestion. And from what I'm seeing in the chat, looks like Brony might make a very good contribution to what we've got going here. But on to the things about otherness, that sort of thing. I have actually experienced, it's not necessarily a sense of otherness. It's more, I am my own observer. Okay, that sounds a little weird. But the feeling itself, as best I can put it, is I am in another part of the universe, if you will, looking at myself as an outsider would. And the thing I found out about that is, as things went on, I have a malformation in the sensory motor area here in the brain, which at one time actually caused motor seizures. And I noticed that those two were very closely related. You know, whenever those muscles in the arm would start locking up, that's when I would feel that outside feeling. Not all the time. I mean, there were times where it would happen without the muscles going, but enough to where I said to myself, okay, it must be associated with this thing going on in the brain. Boring explanation, but it was fascinating, and still is whenever it happens, to experience that, to look at what I happened to be doing at the time, almost as if somebody else was, but I'm knowing that they're looking at it.
Have you ever heard of the practice of the Rosicrucians and their cosmic consciousness?
I'm not altogether familiar with it. I know of it, but not very much about it.
They would be claiming to have this experience of being able to take their consciousness and kind of escape their body and then perceive themselves and others as from a point of view outside of their own body, and as a kind of astral projection and what have you. But but which leads into the thing that I really wanted to talk about. I believe that the vast majority, perhaps, this is my guess, the vast majority of people who claim to believe in God do so for cultural reasons. They do so because this is what they grew up in, and they had no reason to question it. They seem to be surrounded by it. It is for them an axiomatic assumption. And I think that that's probably true of most people. And I say that because most people, when you ask them to talk about it, they can't, and not because it's inarticulate, but because they've never given it any thought of any considerable depth. But I don't think that these are the kinds of people who would have ever invented religions. They're the kind of people who would join in order to be part of a community. I do get the impression that people who end up in positions of leadership in spiritual communities are usually people either who see an opportunity to manipulate others through such an approach, or people who pursue this because they're trying to make sense of this experience that they're having. And so they treat it as a calling, or as at least something they're interested in pursuing. And so I really think that the development of most religious notions of all sorts is actually prompted initially by people who have this experience and are attempting to create for themselves and for others a framework in which to share it. And I think that that's what is going on. And so that I think that so I don't see religions as existing primarily because of their theological claims. I see them as existing because people are looking for theological claims that help to make sense of an experience they can't make sense of. Now, people don't have that experience, then the only reason why they could ever join in is just because, well, this is part of the community, this is what everyone else does. And I think that these people can stand out as being people who are really just part of the club, part of the group, and they can be very passionately so as well. Because I mean, particularly if you enjoy the community you belong to, you have no problem really involving yourself in all of that community's regularities and buzzwords and ideas and theologies and what have you. So I really think though that the real major push for why various religions exist is because of the people who have this experience, cannot let it go, and they propel various different frameworks forward for the purpose of trying to give this experience some sort of context that cannot, in my opinion, actually be properly extracted from it. However, there are some things that I have found to be common in people that I have gotten to know who share with me this inarticulate experience. That is, when I talk to people who can share with me the idea that their sense of God's presence is something that they feel is something that goes beyond the religion or theology that they have embraced, and they recognize that there is some sort of even a conflict between the experience they're having and the framework they've embraced. That these are people who oftentimes have been through horrific abuse and have shown themselves to be resilient, and that this presence was something that they not just commonly experienced, but was something that they experienced in particular, not every time, but at a particularly redemptive moment that was for them a turning point in that abuse.
Bob,
yes.
Over the next few minutes, what I'd like to do, I'd like to open up the conversation to a few of the people who are watching this broadcast. Cap Brony, for instance. Diana, can you send Cap a link?
I'll ask about that and
And
see if they
also,
want to come in. And
okay, see if they
I
can,
can't
because
the
they
link
do
if-
have some questions for you, Bob, and I think this would go very, very positive. And let's go ahead and try to send, I think that Carrie Todd wanted to jump in, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, while we're seeing if they can come in, let me kind of finish where I was going with
Sure.
this. Um, the people that I know of who have had this kind of an experience, where it was for them kind of a way out of a blackness and a hole. They were often people whose experiences were taking them down, 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 becoming very self-loathing people. Living in a very abusive environment, and that there came a day when this experience of otherness gave to them in various different ways, a sensation of, you're okay. This is not your fault. You're not ugly. You're not horrible. You're not disgusting. You are completely acceptable. That doesn't mean you don't have any problems. It doesn't mean you don't have any issues. It doesn't mean your life isn't messed up. It doesn't mean you have your act together. It means that who and what you are as a human being is extremely valuable, and things have simply gone wrong. But it is not that you are a defective existence. And this was a very common sense that these people would have. And I've talked to numerous people who have been through that kind of experience, and they oftentimes tended towards some sort of religious practice that would be like, either charismatic or gifts of the spirit or things like that. And I didn't myself go in that kind of a direction, but the other thing that I noticed about these people is that they identified this as something that they discovered to be sending them a message about themselves that they didn't consider to be entirely unique. That is, although they saw themselves as a unique individual, they also saw themselves as not unique in being accepted by this presence. They perceived that this was a presence that was accepting of everybody, understanding their story, understanding that even the meanest and the cruelest among us have been shaped into a distortion of who we otherwise could have been had our development and our opportunity for growing up been far more optimal. And as a result, I think that many of these people then go into a framework that actually ends up re-imprisoning them in some of that abuse, which is sad, I think, because it seems so normal. And I think that when people are coming out of a very abusive paradigm, there's ways in which they blame themselves. And when they learn to not blame themselves, they don't head straight out. They kind of spiral out of their issues. And by that, I mean, they head out and they head back in, but not as deep. They head out and then back in, but not as deep. And they're spiraling in and out and in and out. And it becomes a lengthy process of their working their way out of that deep hole. But that this sense of otherness becomes for them a very strong motivator and drawing for them to do that. And I've noticed that is very common.
I see Brony's here. Hi there. Sorry if I embarrassed you earlier. I promise I'll be a good girl. And I see Jordan. Hi, Jordan.
Hey, and thank you for inviting me on it. I mean, I haven't ever really heard of you before, Bob, but from what I've heard of you, I really do like you. And just a little bit I heard, I have probably a million questions I could ask you. One of the ones that was kind of a follow-up to mine on the feeling that I did want to ask was how much do you think your environment would let me go get the actual question. Hold on. Because I did ask it up in here. Where is it? Okay, yeah. How much do you think that the environment that people are brought up in could impact the feeling of belief or the belief and the sense of feeling that they have? Like, how much do you think is that involved or around the environment and your upbringing versus the
Yeah.
actual feeling.
Well, in some sense, this goes back to the nurture versus nature
Yeah.
argument, and something that I think has been made way too much of. I don't know that we're even capable of. Yes, I think we definitely identify nature and identify nurture as both having powerful influences on us, probably in ways we don't even yet understand, and that they do it at the same time. So that I'm not so sure we can actually divvy it up in a way that we can count on. So I'm sure that both of them may play a role. For example, it's quite possible that there may be this could be a feature that exists in certain personality predispositions. That's a possibility, and people who might have this tendency to be what we might think of as more spiritual or something. It's so that's a real possibility that there's just this innate predisposition that exists in the variations of human beings as they happen to step out of the womb. But also the experience that we have in growing up, who are be it one of love, be it one of abuse, it can help to reshape the way that develops. I know enough about human development to know that there are a number of things that go on in the development of a child. Some of these things are very age dependent. I mean, when you look at Eric Erikson or Piaget, there are certain life challenges that need to be met, and if they're met successfully, they actually prepare you for the next challenge. And these challenges are going to be met at specific ages where you seem to have been maturated to the point where that's the relevant challenge for your life. Um, there are ways in which these things could either lean you maybe artificially into that direction, or perhaps lean you artificially away from that direction. Who's to say? I don't know that we have a way of actually really determining that. But I think that since we know that human development can go through these stages, I don't think we can dismiss these as possibly playing a very real role in this dynamic. It would seem to me they would have to at least shape it. And since I'm a person who would say that I think that I see this experience of God's presence existing in numerous different religions, I'm tending to believe that the specifics of these different religions are really just the different frameworks they worked out, and that they might all really be coming from a very similar human experience, be it artificial, be it real, be it whatever, but that it could be something where the differences in various religious attitudes or religions or even different denominations are simply just shaped culturally and by that environment that does that. And I think this is true not just of our spiritual feelings, but many times of our political feelings I mean, there are some cultures that are far more corporal in their identity, where they feel that they identify themselves as part of a community, and there's other cultures where I'm an individual, and so you ask somebody, who are you? And you go, well, I'm a guitar player, and I'm a mathematician, and I do and I like to watch science fiction, and they tell you all about themselves. And you ask somebody else, well, who are you? Well, I'm a mother, and I have 5 children, and I just love them dearly, and I really care about animals, and some people identify themselves in terms of how they relate to the outer world, and other people identify themselves in terms of the relationship they have with themselves, and that this tends to be distributed differently in individualistic cultures than it is in, say, more corporal cultures. And as a result, our attitudes about economy, about government, about this seem to be very much shaped by that culture. And I couldn't imagine that our sense of God, be it a very real or a very artificial one, would be in any way an exception to that dynamic. So I really think that obviously nature and nurture both are somehow playing a role in here, but exactly how, I think all we can do is guess.
Okay.
Does that?
Yeah, that does. And I do want to say thank you for being honest enough to say you don't know, and so just trying to give me some really, oh, well, I know that. I run into that too much. So and that's what I really liked about you, and that's why when you answered my first question, I was like, hey, thank you for the honest answer. Yeah. It actually brings up another point, because more in the realms of, I guess, nature part, but you mentioned the individualistic society would have more maybe that like sense of like where you're looking for something. Do you think that the societies that are more like that might be more spiritual because of the way that our brains are or that we might be more spiritual because the way our brains are hardwired to try and find patterns, and they're trying to find a pattern to these feelings they're having, and that might lead them to God through the sense, and also through the sense of the unknown.
If I understand your question correctly, I would say that I think that dynamic, if it's going on, the need to make sense of pattern recognition, and of course, many studies have been done to show that we see patterns where there clearly aren't any.
Yeah,
You know,
that was.
But I would say that I don't know that is in any manner particularly unique to individualistic cultures versus corporal cultures. That the individualistic versus corporal cultures, it tends to be where their focus is, not necessarily how their sensory perceptions then or the heuristics that might be made to the brain would work. It's just the objects of thought and focus that they're brought to are going to be different as a result of it. So, I mean, you know, Buddhist cultures have a tendency to be far more corporal, and there's a certain spirituality there. And some people are not aware of this, but in some places on the globe, people consider themselves to be both Christians and Buddhists because they perceive Buddhism as a style of approach and Christianity as a particular thing to approach. And there's a lot of people in Korea who would see themselves as both Buddhists and Christians. It's kind of like, you know, I meditate a lot, you know, or something, you know.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. I'm sorry if I misunderstood when you were explaining the culture. Sorry if I misunderstood that.
Yeah. I think that it just expresses itself differently.
Okay.
And I was using that as an example of it. If you were born in America, but as a baby transported to one of these other cultures, you will grow up in that other culture as if you were one of them.
Yeah.
And that being the case, that shows me that, and we see that this is true of many different dynamics, that's not just spiritual ideas, that we adapt to the environment in which we're in culturally in so many ways, that this shows the flexibility in the epigenetic aspects of any predispositions we may have are going to be very much reshaped by the cultural environment we find ourselves having to grow up in, including the need to find your own niche. I mean, if you grow up in a big family, a part of the reason why people can be so different in a particular family is because each child is growing up trying to find a niche that nobody else has so they can be their own unique self.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Sorry, that was really my two big ones that I had for you, and thank you for answering. That was
Sure.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll probably come up with some more, but I'll let someone else.
If you come up with more, just ask. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us tonight. So kind of you. Jordan, did you have a question? And I think Daryl has a point to make as well.
Not currently, but I'm listening.
Okay.
Daryl.
Let me go on to this next thing that I was wanting to talk about. Daryl mentioned about, it's giving God all the glory. And many of the people that I've talked to who seem to possess this strong sense of presence want to believe that it's like Jesus displacing them. And it becomes, I think, for them, and not for all of them, but for many of them, a very unhealthy self-erasure. I think in many ways it is themselves that is coming out, but they just don't want to admit that it's them. It's like, well, I can't really love you except it's God in me loving you, you know, and there's this self-effacement and there's this fractured self, I think, that they're developing, where they allow parts of themselves to develop optimally, but only as if by proxy of the indwelling Jesus. And I see that as something that perhaps helps them get beyond to transcend certain challenges, but at the same time, kicking themselves in the face. And I used to tell some people like this, well, you know, it's God in me that loves you. And then I would oftentimes want to say to them, who needs you? I don't. I want you to love me. And if you don't love me, I don't really care about God in you loving me if you're not kind of going along with this. But I actually see that as one of those cultural attempts to embrace this, because I think we all do no matter who we are, we recognize that we have faults. We're growing up. We have naivete, and I think that sometimes we are even overly morally condemning of ourselves for this. And instead of recognizing that we're people who are growing and learning, we think that we can kind of help this process along by developing some sort of theology that forces this presence that I experience to somehow be something that takes me over instead of something that might even be me, as Daryl even said, and maybe it's me inside just trying to come out. Maybe there's something that's the spirit of humanity that's simply just trying to find its way out through all the crap that can so damage us as we develop. Who knows? But I've seen it expressed in some very, what it strikes me as unhealthy ways, but also in the lives of some people who were perhaps desperately in need of it. Something Dr. Jones and I were talking about the other day is that there are some people who have found in their faith an anchor that has helped them to find a way of becoming a better person. Now, this isn't true the way of all people handle religion. Some people, religion is them an opportunity to become very self-justified in a great deal of evil. Who knows how people handle religion in the way that they want to, as a way of, facing the challenges in the way that occurs to them is, the most economical way to do it, or the most opportunistic way.
Yeah.
So, as a result, I think that when people do this, they have found that this is something that helps them to put away, the anger of the past, put away the things in the past that would drag them down, so that they can now somehow move above and transcend. And this helps them give some distance, but I think it also keeps them from having some appropriate closure and genuine overcoming of some of those things from the past that may have done some damage. So I can see how this can have some psychological benefits as well as some psychological harm, which is one reason why I would encourage as many people as possible who deal with this experience. Don't take your explanation of the experience seriously as much as you take the fact that this is your experience and the strengths that you might be able to draw from it. Do that. If this is part of who you are, but be you, and but don't box yourself into another corner that you're just going to get painted into, so that you can't get out, because you become part of a community that's going to crucify you if you ever reject the faith or something like that. Oh, you're going to find yourself in a possibly precarious position again.
Yeah, it reminds me of a friend of mine who she's spiritualist because she believes that we're all connected like through some spiritual force, but that's more or less about it. But on something you said, I just want to make sure I understood. You mentioned religion and it kind of not bringing closure at times. I don't know exactly how you worded it and what you were just saying. But so do you feel that religion maybe is used as a coping mechanism, but because it's being used as a coping mechanism, it becomes more of a crutch and doesn't help you get over what you're trying to cope with?
Let's be clear about one thing. It's many things to many different people for many different reasons.
Okay.
And none of that, but if you broke a leg, you might actually need a crutch for a while.
Yeah.
And so I think I've known people whose religious ideas have been something that brought them out of the muck and mire, and then once they're out of the muck and mire, they're moving along, and their faith may be important to them, but it's not the kind of thing that they're relying on. I am a strong believer, based on my own study in human development, that the healthiest you is going to be one where you have a sense that for whatever reasons or for whatever processes brought you there, you are becoming a person who's at least adequate to the challenges of life because you are a human being. And that's part of what it means to be a human being who's healthy, who's become well adjusted. You are adequate to the challenge. You're not perfect, but the sense that you are, your existence makes sense, it is acceptable, and if the challenges are not going to be overly cruel or overwhelming, or by people who just have something over on you that you can't overcome, you're going to do just fine being you. I really think that that's a more healthy and optimal way of approaching this. And to the degree that any religion we embrace erases us, or for example, there are a lot of people who believe that God is very angry at you and that he wants to send you to hell, and
Yeah.
he's going to cover you in the blood of Jesus. And so when he looks at you, he doesn't see you for the piece of shit you are. He sees Jesus. Oh my goodness. I mean, well, at least I'm not going to fry forever. I'm thankful for that. But I feel like I'm going to a place I don't belong. It's not me.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is such a kick in the pants, a kick in the teeth, that I really, that's an unfortunate view. Now, I can also understand how people who believe in God, who experience other people who are bad, could like the idea that, well, God has got to send these people to hell. I'd feel pretty good about that. And of course, in order to be consistent, that means, my kids, if they're not going to do this, they're headed for hell. I better get them saved or whatever. I mean, and so it becomes a story that ends up having regrettable implications you hadn't thought of at the time you came up with the story, And so I see that as a part of the dynamic too. And as a result, I consider spirituality to be something that has a great deal of potential usefulness and health, but it also can, I mean, this is a knife that can cut both ways.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. That was, thank you. You're way smarter than I am. I'll say that.
Thanks.
Oh, that's about all I have right now.
And I don't know if I'm smarter, but I'll tell you that I really think that sometimes the path of my life was one that I feel fortunate about, that it, I've been in good places, I've been in bad places, I've had very educated and skillful people around me, I've had very mean and cruel people around, and so my experience has simply given to me this perspective that I've had to develop. And so if my experiences hadn't been what they were, I would be a different person. And, in fact, in many ways, I grew up in a home where the criticism was so overwhelming and powerful and debilitating that I think it actually forced me as a young person to not be able to participate in the culture well enough. And I really had to struggle to find a way of getting out of that hole. And as I wanted to become a more, quote, normal person, I found out that the normal people were far more functional than I were, but I didn't think they were doing any better. And it made me realize, I got to rethink a lot of this. And I realized that people at every level of functionality and every level of life, whether they're rich, poor, whether they have lots of skills or none, that a lot of us are very, very much hurting and trying to figure out, what is this thing called life, and what is its value, and who am I? And sometimes these questions can hurt us so much we don't even dare ask them, because we're afraid the answer might be something
we don't want to face. Yeah. All right. Yeah. All right. I think that might be it for now for my question. If I think of any, I'll be sure to ask.
Awesome.
Sorry for asking all the questions.
No. I love it. Yeah.
Thanks for jumping in.
Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah, Daryl, I think
stick
you had
around.
something to say. I saw your face there for a moment, so go ahead and ask.
Okay. Well, it's not really a question. I was just going to relate, just in brief, my own experience. I don't know that it's all that uncommon, at least bits and pieces of it or certain parts of it, but it just kind of shows how confusing things can get if you really have a desire to do good in life, so to speak. I remember as a very young boy, prior to the age of 11, I'll put it that way, I remember laying in bed at night and praying and asking God to bless my family and different ones. And I just really felt like someone was listening. I don't know where I got that notion, but I enjoyed it. It felt good. I slept good as a young boy. But one day, my parents, they took us to church, and one day the preacher convinced me that I needed to get saved. I was going to go to hell if I didn't come forward and do certain things. So I did, and I really felt good about that for a while. Okay, I did what I was supposed to do, so I'm okay now. But then a time came later in my life when I realized that I didn't have the Holy Ghost. I didn't have the Spirit of God in my life, and I needed that. And so I went through a process there, and someone told me, okay, now you have it. Okay, now I can be a good person. And I remember one of my friends told me, how can that be? You're one of the best people I've ever known. And, he said that from his heart. He really felt that way about me. And I said, well, it's not what I heard. I needed this. And now, I'm okay. And then a few years later, it finally got to the point where this thing just wasn't working. It's like, something is wrong with this. The fruit of the Spirit, that is the Spirit that I was supposed to have invited into my life and it came in. It's wonderful things, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, goodness, things of this nature. And I didn't see a lot of this. I saw some of this going on in places where it wasn't supposed to be. And so, needless to say, I could see something was amiss. And I've come to the place in my life, as I stated earlier, that I'm good with the fact whether there's a God involved in this or not. It really doesn't matter to me. But what I'm experiencing now is the best it's ever been. And I'm me. I'm just what you see. I'm a little bit different than probably what you see on your screen in person. But this is kind of a replica of who I am sitting here. And I don't, as I've stated, I don't have to know that there's a God that's making me this way. Maybe there is, maybe there's not. That doesn't really matter to me. Whatever my experience is, as far as I'm concerned, I'm just a human being. And, this is what every human being can experience. Just the good things in life, if you will, the fruit of the Spirit that I just mentioned. Love, joy, peace, all these things are present. Where do they come from? Well, just maybe from being human. That's good enough.
And I think that's very true. Although unfortunately, a great number of people in this world live in such conditions that this is a luxury for us.
Absolutely.
To have these kinds of feelings. Now, this might sound like it's off topic at first. Human beings have something we call stereoscopic vision, which gives us a sense of being able to just immediately feel that we have a sense of how far away from us things are. Now, those of us who have it may think that, well, of course I can see how far away something is. There it is. It's like 50 feet away. What do you mean, depth perception? Well, as it turns out, we've discovered that depth perception is something that you acquire around the age of 18 months. Your eyes are going through a process of your brain kind of figuring out the parallax and all that's going on. And we've also discovered that if you have to wear an eye patch because you have an eye infection or this and that is on for too long during this critical period, you will never develop stereoscopic vision. You will still have, the vision, the parallax, and you'll see in stereo as it were, but you will not have that same immediate sense of how far away something is. You have to stop to actually even think about it. Whereas if you have developed stereoscopic vision, you look at it and your estimate of how far away it is as good as your own spatial recognition. And you don't sit there and go, okay, well, let's see, if I'm going this, and I guess, okay, that's probably, it's like 50 feet away. You don't have to calculate it. Your brain has got this just figured out for you. It goes through. Now, I said that to say this, that there seem to be certain developmental things that human beings go through as they become what it is to be human. And that some of these things are very age dependent. They can only occur at a certain moment in time, a certain window. Other things are very plastic and can happen at almost any time or in any sequence. Some things can only happen in a certain sequence, but at any time. And so, I mean, there's a wide variety of human abilities and skills in meeting the challenges of our environment. that are like this. One of them, though, is this. It seems to me that one of those things that is very derived for human beings psychologically is love. If we are not loved by someone, treated with great affection in our younger days, um, we will have a hard time loving ourselves, and we'll have a hard time loving others. But if we ever go through that experience of being genuinely loved, as not just loved by somebody who thinks that they will love us because they're nice, but somebody who loves us because they see in us something that is truly lovely and lovable, and that love that I am receiving is something I am truly um, worthy of at some level. This is part of what seems to be essential in most human lives before they can become a more loving person themselves. It seems as that love is one of these human abilities, and by that I mean a vital love, not just affection, not just saying, "Well, I like people," or "I like, or I like girls," or whatever. But when we actually see a value in somebody else's existence, that we truly want to be helping them to celebrate it and to develop it and to protect it, and there's something where we just find this value of humanity that compels us to behave in such a way. This is something that usually happens because we've experienced that kind of love and acceptance already, and when we've had that, the potential that it brings to us is something that when we see somebody else who's not experiencing we want to give that to them if we can. We want to be a part of that in their lives if possible. If it lifted me up out of the mire, being seen as lovely to somebody who really uh, treated us as truly worthwhile and precious, it's more likely to cause us to be a person who wants to give other people that experience of your existence is precious, and that's something apart from your behavior. I'll tell you, it is a very powerful experience if you can sit in front of a person who's very troubled, and you can be very honest with them about how unacceptable their behavior is, and yet how precious a human existence they are, and how their behavior is in some ways a something gone wrong in their life and development that has bent the twig, and that who and what they really could be is something so much more wonderful than this, and that they're robbing themselves, as it were, not discovering this. When you can do that, that seems to be the kind of a thing that human beings don't do until they've experienced it themselves. It's like vital love is a derived experience. It doesn't come out of you. It's born in you when you receive it, and then it comes out of you. It's like everyone needs to be kick-started in that way, perhaps. But anyhow, this relates to that sense of otherness, the way that some people have dealt with it. And that way, I see this as perhaps a mixed bag, and in that way, when people experience this otherness in this way, where it becomes something that inspires them to become all that they can be as a human being, I think that's a great thing. And there's other people for whom, even if in an unhealthy way, it has helped bring them out of the miry clay, that we certainly don't want to take their framework away from them just because we think their framework is false. This is what they're hanging on to, and if they can't quite get a grip on it, it's a lot easier to get a grip on a fake framework upon which you can attach a real experience than to just have that experience go adrift with nothing to hang on to. And so I think we should be careful. If you're a person who doesn't have this sense of faith, I don't know that you need it. But don't be so rambunctious in trying to take it away from other people for whom this might be, uh, given the condition they're in, their only redemptive opportunity to overcome some of the damage and road film of life that has kind of pulled them down. Let them do that which is going to work for them, even if it is for that temporary period, a crutch. Yeah, I would encourage that. Anyway, I don't know if there's much more we can say about this other than to recognize that it can be explored in many ways, and maybe we could talk about that later. But tonight, I just wanted to talk about what it was and maybe give it a potential positive spin to see that this could be a good thing for some of the people who are into it. It's been a good thing for me. It changed my life when I finally learned to lean into it in what I thought was a healthy way.
That's excellent. If no one else has a comment, I think we're going to get out of here. So I'm going to count to three. 1, 2, 3. Any comment?
Sure, I got something I could
Yeah,
say.
go for it, Jordan.
I, I've had conversations with people at my church about how, when they accepted Jesus into their heart and started loving God, that it was God that made them a better person. And so, of course, they start to attribute positive changes to God, and um, and I, of course, want to offer them the alternative perspective that maybe it was really them that changed. It's not so much that God is playing an active role in that. Um, and this also ties into when someone thinks that God is speaking to them. Is it really God, or are they coming up with these thoughts themselves? And um, of course, that this was like the epistemic question that I would raise to people. And how do you distinguish between your own thoughts and God's thoughts? And because if it's going to be in your head, um, it's very easy to think it's your own, and even if it was God, it would be difficult to distinguish between the two, I think.
I don't know how one would, unless someone's going in a very unhealthy direction, why would one have to? And I think that those are great questions for you, but maybe they're not such great questions for the people you'd like to ask. You know what I'm saying? Um, I mean, but I think that I when it comes down to it, most people in this life that you're going to run into are not interested in having that kind of critical thinking, perhaps not even capable of it. And and if they're not capable of it, does this mean well they have to live in shit all their lives just because they don't see any way out except by this weird artificial crutch? If it makes them a better person, you know, better becoming a better person is always a trajectory. It's always a process. Maybe to be ready for something better even in years to come. One thing I think is true, not of all people, but of the vast majority of people who become deeply religious, uh, that lasts for about 7 years and they move on. And if they had any real benefit that came from it, they will tend to retain a lot of that. Not all of them. Some of them get burned by religion and become very angry and anti-religious. So I mean, this can develop in a wide variety of directions. But I would wonder if those are interesting questions. I think they're good ones, but they may not be relevant to a person's life at this point in time. And so why ask? And is this really the time for them to know the answer?
Yeah, I think I'm driven to ask the question when I get the sense that it's getting in the way of them self-love, as you mentioned earlier, where it's like it's kind of turned ugly, where they think very low of themselves, even though they think highly of God and other people. So like I want to offer them an alternative perspective that it might be themselves that are wanting good, not just God, and kind of
Dropping the suggestion is probably the best you can do because
yeah.
if you do more, you might be ripping the rug out from under them. But I do think that it's a very legitimate concern and probably a good thing to suggest the alternative. You know,
Yeah.
but let offer it. Uh, but if you get them in defense mode, they're only going to just dig in deeper.
Yeah, and yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to do that. I think, and part of the reason why I would want to offer that alternative is because if they do start to question their notions of God, then they can still maintain a healthy self-image if they lose their previous
There were
faith.
changes, you just attributed them wrong, and these were good changes. So keep up the good work and just
Yeah,
just drop the error. Right.
yeah. And one of the analogies that I've heard is it is it Dumbo, that elephant or something?
Dumbo the elephant, yep.
Yeah, Dumbo the elephant had this feather, and like he attributed his ability to fly to the feather, but actually when he got rid of the feather, he found out, he had the ability in himself. So like, uh, it's like posing to Dumbo the question, do you really need this feather? And like, you know, what if perhaps it's in you and it's not in this other thing?
It can be a bridge to cross.
Yeah, it would be just like a way of helping them transition if they start to question.
I think my days as a pastor were, for me, a part of that bridge. I couldn't do that anymore. But I think that, particularly in the trajectory I was headed in, that it made me want to be a far more, it made me more humanitarian. Religion for me at that time became a framework in which to reach out to people, to help them learn to love themselves and to learn to love others and to celebrate this mysterious thing we call life. And as a result, that also forced me to then abandon a lot of that theology that I saw was really contrary to that as a goal. And oddly enough, the thing that's so strange, maybe not a good way, I found that I went through these paths by looking for things more in depth, discovering I can't find anything more in depth that I can really nail to the wall. And I ended up really returning to the faith of my 6-year-old self, of this presence of an indescribable otherness. I don't know what it's doing. I don't know what it's not doing. I don't know how to describe it. I don't know if it's real, authentic, me or God or whatever. It feels to me like God. I relate to it that way, and I don't know how to not relate to it that way. And I just intellectually realize that, okay, all right. So to me, my confession of faith is really an admission of where I find myself. It is not a claim about what the reality or truth is of the matter.
Well said, Bob. I think we're going to leave it at that tonight, and it's been marvelous, wonderful having all of you guys join us. And so with that said, we're getting out of here. Good night.
Good night, all.